There is a moment in every hero's journey when they have to face the inevitable, when they have to confront not just the bad guy, but their own darker impulses. That hero has a choice. They can give in, they can be a killer, or they can make the hard choice, the right choice. The Alpha has existed on the margins of Beacon Hills for long enough. Now it's time to come out of the shadows. This is Night School. The episode picks up where we left off. Derek is dead, Deaton is missing, and Scott and Stiles are trapped in the school. Stiles echoes Derek's accusation.
No, it's your boss.
What? Deaton? The Alpha? Your boss?
No.
Yes, murdering psycho werewolf.
Deaton may be missing, but that's not enough evidence to tie him to the Alpha. Scott won't assign blame until it's staring him in the face. So the boys make a plan. Get past the Alpha, get to the Jeep, and get away from the school. Only there's one problem. With the Jeep rendered useless, Scott and Stiles retreat to the boys' locker room. Scott wants to call the sheriff, but Stiles doesn't want his dad, or anyone else, to get hurt. There is one more option. Derek drove separately to the school, meaning Scott and Stiles could take his car and escape.
Go outside, we get the keys off his body, and then we take his car. And him.
Before they can leave, a sudden sound of someone or something interrupts them. Scott and Stiles barricade themselves inside the lockers, the tension of their trapped silence filling up the room. But it's just the janitor, and as the janitor tries to push Scott and Stiles out, he becomes the Alpha's first victim.
You're a horrible liar, and you've been lying all night.
The world is bigger than Scott McCall. Allison thinks she's just been stood up by her boyfriend. Jackson and Lydia swing by, and just as she's about to give up on waiting, Allison receives a text. It's from Scott telling her to come to the school because it's an emergency. Only Scott doesn't have a phone.
Stop!
I'm not dying here. I'm not dying at school.
We're not going to die.
The school has become a claustrophobic maze. Scott and Stiles can't find their way out, and the Alpha is chasing them down. And I don't care what anyone says about the CGI, this thing terrifies me. Stiles asks an important question. What does the Alpha want? But Scott knows, and has known since the events of pack mentality.
It's you, Scott. You're the one he wants.
Oh, great. A psychotic werewolf who's into teamwork. That's beautiful.
And it's only a matter of time before the Alpha gets what he wants. Our B team arrives at the school. Allison is unperturbed, but notices that Scott and Stiles seem to have broken into the building. Jackson shows genuine concern at Allison going into the school by herself, and Lydia takes notice. Meanwhile, the game of cat and mouse continues. Scott and Stiles manage to trap the Alpha in the basement, but only briefly before it breaks out through the ceiling. Outside, Jackson changes his mind and decides to follow Allison, but Lydia, afraid of deja vu, forces him to take her with him.
Just stay in the damn.
Do not leave me alone in the car.
The pair discover scratches on Stiles' Jeep, and Jackson starts to connect the dots, his music cue playing in the background. Allison, no stranger to wandering dark and creepy sets by herself, sets out to find Scott. Blink and you'll miss it, but there is a terrifying shot of the Alpha behind Allison before moving on. As Jackson and Lydia enter the school, Jackson too has an encounter with the Alpha, only he sees it. And you have to wonder, why isn't the Alpha going after Scott's friends? Scott and Stiles find Allison, and they also find Jackson and Lydia, and that brief moment of peace is cut short when the Alpha chases after all of them, forcing the group to barricade themselves inside a classroom.
Really beautiful job, everyone. Now, what should we do about the 20-foot wall of windows?
The next sequence is emotionally complex and one of the key points of the episode. There are 5 points of view to balance. Lydia, who is reliving her nightmare, Jackson, who is starting to connect the dots, Allison, who until now hasn't had any encounter with the Alpha and is searching for answers, and Scott and Stiles, who are both trying to keep their own secrets.
Somebody killed the janitor.
What?
Yeah, the janitor's dead.
I'm struck by how different Stiles has been acting thus far. His normally sporadic and hyper-fixated behavior has been replaced by someone dangerously level-headed. Stiles is able to think clearly, preventing both him and Scott from making any rash decisions while trapped in the school. And I know I was complaining about him in the last episode, but Stiles proves time and time again that his first priority is to look out for Scott. That's why he deletes the video of the Alpha off of Lydia's phone, and why he lies now to protect Scott's identity. He is the only person on Scott's side. Styles may not be able to physically protect anyone, but he can keep a cool head when it comes to protecting his loved ones. Scott now has his part to play in this lie. Yes, someone killed the janitor, but there's still the question of who, why, and why this person is now chasing down Scott and his friends. Obviously, Scott can't tell the truth without exposing everything, including his own identity, so he gets desperate.
It's Derek. Look, it's Derek Hale.
Wait, Derek killed the janitor?
Are you sure?
I saw him.
The mountain lake.
No, Derek killed them.
All of them?
There are so many micro interactions happening in this room. In one sequence, Styles picks up Scott's lie about Derek without hesitation, but panics when the others want to call the police, not wanting to put his dad in danger.
What do you mean, no?
I mean, no. You want to hear it in Spanish? No.
Jackson makes a move against him and Scott steps in. There's a clear divide between Jackson, Lydia, and Allison, and Scott and Styles, both in information and in loyalty. It doesn't matter anyway because it seems someone gave the station a fake tip that there would be prank calls coming from the school, so there isn't going to be a police rescue. In another sequence, Allison tries to get answers out of Scott directly, but he snaps at her to avoid telling the truth. Here, Styles steps in to cool things down, and the pair try to figure out their next move.
Hey, first off, throwing Derek under the bus, nicely done.
I think we can forgive him in the moment since Derek is presumably dead. Jackson pushes Styles to call his dad directly, and Scott agrees, much to Styles' shock. Eventually he does, though there's no answer, but not without a rare burst of violence toward Jackson. But the gang's time is up, and the Alpha has found them. Scott and friends escape out up to the next floor, this time barricading themselves in a chemistry classroom. There is a door that goes up to the roof and would allow everyone to escape, but it's locked, and Scott conveniently remembers that the janitor, who was killed earlier in the episode, would have a copy of the key. Chekhov, meet gun. Styles vehemently disagrees, naturally because this plan would put Scott directly in harm's way, but Scott pushes anyway. This micro-interaction is important too. Styles schemes and avoids direct confrontation as much as possible and has been all night, but Scott recognizes that sometimes direct action is the best action, and he knows that he's the only one capable of making that sacrifice. Luckily, in a well-timed burst of brilliance, Lydia suggests making a Molotov cocktail, they are in a chemistry room, to help protect Scott.
What? I read it somewhere.
Suddenly, Allison finds herself being the weakest link. She doesn't know how to be useful and frankly hasn't been all night, and now she's begging for Scott to not risk his life by leaving.
Do you remember when you told me you knew whether or not I was lying, that I had to tell?
I'd know if you were lying anyway.
Oh, really?
You have a tell.
So do you. You're a horrible liar, and you've been lying all night.
I don't mean to call Allison useless in a harsh way, rather I want to help give context to some of her motivations for later this season, and trust me, this is a defining moment for her. And as much as Allison begs and pleads, with even their love theme playing in the background, Scott knows what he has to do. Our hero has to finish this journey alone. This scene clocks in at just over 3 minutes, and it's filled with an oppressive silence. The unsettling stillness, every shadow a potential threat, it's so unlike the school we've known so far. Scott's nose takes him to the gymnasium, where he finds the janitor dead, bloody, and hanging under the bleachers. Meanwhile, Jackson comforts Allison, Styles notices, and Lydia is suddenly concerned that Jackson may have not given her all the necessary ingredients to create the Molotov cocktail. That is, could Jackson have given Lydia the wrong ingredient, thereby sabotaging Scott's chances against the Alpha?
I gave you exactly what you asked for tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you did.
As Scott makes a move for the janitor's keys, the Alpha tries to trap him in the bleachers. Scott escapes and tries to use the Molotov cocktail, and we unfortunately get our answer about Jackson's actions. The Alpha advances and takes Scott down, evoking this terrifying image. It lets out a blood-curdling roar, and while the sound only startles Styles and Allison, it's somehow powerful enough to hurt both Lydia and Jackson. Styles notices the scratches on Jackson's neck and files that information away for later. Meanwhile, the Alpha's roar was powerful enough to force Scott to shift. If you pay close attention, you can see the red bleeding from Scott's eyes before they turn gold. Just as Styles' cold stillness has been a sharp departure from his usual character, Scott's wolf is equally as chilling. His movements are slow, measured, and predatory, and as he makes his way back to the classroom, we get the feeling that it's not to protect his friends. And it almost seems that way, but as Scott turns the key and hears Allison's voice, he's pulled back, just as he was pulled back on the lacrosse field in Second Chance at First Line, and when he tried to control his heart rate in Heart Monitor. And instead of breaking in, he breaks the key in the lock, protecting his friends from himself. But his friends, of course, don't know this. Just when they think that this is it and that Scott left them for dead, Lydia hears something.
Do you hear that? You don't hear that.
Our heroes may have survived the night, but there is so much yet to come. The sheriff finds no evidence throughout the school of anything that transpired that night, and while Stiles is relieved at having made it out alive, Scott is more suspicious.
We were in the chemistry room. It walked right by us. You don't think that it heard us? You don't think it knew exactly where we were?
And we know that the Alpha wants Scott in its pack. But not only that, it wants Scott to kill. It wants Scott to kill his own pack.
Allison, Jackson, Lydia. You.
And the worst part for Scott is that for a brief moment, he wanted to make that kill. There is no sunrise to mark the end of a night of horrors, but there are ambulance lights, and with it the surprise that Deaton is alive and just as bewildered as everyone else. Could he have been the Alpha this whole time and shifted back just in time? We'll just have to wait for that answer. And speaking of answers, Allison is tired of waiting for one from Scott. All night Scott was lying to her, and locking her in the chemistry room was the final nail in the coffin. Even though her family is lying to Allison, it's Scott's lies that hurt the most.
Right now, I don't feel like I can trust you.
Night School is a bottle episode, the kind of episode that is filmed with a lower budget, fewer sets, and a less complex plot. It's the perfect recipe for dramatic and revealing character work. And it's the perfect culmination of the first 6 episodes, laying the groundwork for the dramatic shift in tone for the rest of the season. It's cinematic, self-contained, and an homage to the classic horror movie. I can't recommend enough that you watch this episode on your own. For Scott, Stiles, Allison, Jackson, and even Lydia, this episode blows everything up in their faces, and it's the events of this episode that drive their motivations later, and kicks off the final act of season 1. Lydia gets pushed further away from Jackson as she tries to come to terms with what she's been through. Jackson becomes more determined than ever to understand the secret that Scott is hiding, and this brings him closer to Allison, who is driven just as equally to grapple with how useless she felt all night, and to stop waiting for answers. It's not going to be easy for Stiles from here on out to just be by Scott's side, especially as they both deal with the fallout from this episode. Stiles' insecurities haven't disappeared, they just need the right motivation to come back out. As for Scott, the promise he made in Heart Monitor is important now more than ever. He can't stand around while people get hurt, and he knows he'll have to confront the Alpha once more. But it's not just the Alpha that Scott is afraid of, it's himself, of what he's capable of, and as much as he wants to protect people, he might just end up hurting them, just as he almost did tonight. But Scott chose to hold back. He chose to save his friends, and he's capable of making that choice again. It's that instinct, that drive to protect rather than kill, that will determine Scott's character as we head toward the finale. See you in the next one.